Hello, you're listening to Hugo Rifkin here on Times Radio, and I'm joined by Mark Urban, as I am every Monday. Hello, Mark.
Good morning.
Welcome back.
Morning.
Look, you're normally here to talk diplomatic and defence, but let's begin by talking about something else. We
Real
will get to that in a
warfare.
moment. Real warfare, exactly. Let's start by talking about the BBC, where
Yeah.
you worked for only 35 years.
Yeah.
You've written an interesting piece about it on your Substack. Your Substack is called War and Peace. What's your top line? What do you make of these resignations?
Well, clearly the BBC is central to the culture wars, and you've got two sides, haven't you? And people are saying on the left, well, how come, with all these right-wing people on the board and all the rest of it, the BBC was allegedly biased to the left, and then you've got people on the other side of it saying that, the BBC misrepresented issues ranging from gender to Gaza and all the rest of it. And of course I would say, well, yeah, both of these things are true. And of course it's also self-evidently true that, media barons and, the populist right want to do the BBC down. The central problem is that if you have an internal system for addressing these issues, and it doesn't work, you've got a big problem. And that's why this memo leaked, because the person who was doing investigations and picking up these questions on behalf of the board, in fact, on behalf of us as the licence payer, felt that he was getting completely inadequate answers. This was Michael Prescott, formerly a political editor of the Sunday Times. And so he wrote a report to the board saying, management are just not taking these issues at all seriously and are giving me very inadequate answers. So that's really the core of this crisis, is that this memo by Prescott leaked. Yeah, a lot of people have focused on the Trump editing question, but that was only one of, several or eight quite big issues in there. And I think, well, you have to take this seriously. This isn't some populist rightist having a go at you because you're the BBC. This is the internal person who you've hired to scrutinise your editorial standards, saying you've got big problems and no one will take them seriously. So yeah, it is a crisis, and I think it's important that these things have come to a head. I think it's right that the director of news resigned because of this. She resigned on Saturday evening. I think there's some quite interesting questions about, with her having gone, why did the Director General then follow on Sunday? Why did he resign as well? Quite an interesting topic, that, I think.
Something that comes out quite strongly from your Substack, aside from your views on Sydney Sweeney, which I found very interesting, was the suggestion that, two things I wanted to bring up. One is the idea that newsrooms are often staffed by sort of inherently progressive people, because they're generally people from a liberal arts background, they're generally urbanites, they're generally people who have made a choice to work in media rather than some other, perhaps better remunerated, but kind of sort of less sort of public focused profession, and that does breed a type.
Yeah, well, and I think it breeds a groupthink. I mean, my reference to the row over the jeans advert with Sydney Sweeney was about the belief on a certain type of self-described progressive that certain things are self-evidently true, which we might call a set of values. And that's why I linked it to that. And of course, yes, liberal graduates. And I think the thing that a lot of people miss in this, they see this in old left-right terms as, well, of course it leaked to the Telegraph, that right-wing rag. But one of the other things I related in my blog was that Newsnight, when I was working on it, came under attack as news white for being too white, for not having any presenter of colour, from the Daily Mail. It's not that you have to read The Guardian to see the effects of identity politics and the younger generation who are very seized of these matters percolating through the journalistic system. You see it across the board. And of course, what you have in the BBC is a generational struggle that is also playing out in many other organisations, be they publicly funded or be they private corporations, whatever.
But I mean, that's sort of what fascinates me, because I mean that comes across very strongly as well. Like, I was a young man once, and working for whatever organisation. If I had reservations about the general direction of the organisation I was working for, and I was 22 and I wanted to get on in them, I shut up. And there's something very remarkable about the way that the BBC, like many organisations, seems to be sort of enthralled to what its most recent entries think, sort of terrified of getting on the wrong side of people who've worked there for 6 months.
Well, and let's face it, to use that awful word wokery or that stance in politics, which embraces those phrases like silence is violence and don't be a bystander. The value of your lived experience. All of these things really put the onus on the young person who feels either offended or feels the coverage is biased against what they believe in to speak up. And so you do get a much more vocal kind of discussion about it. And back in the day, we did tend to just buckle down. I mean, the BBC has always had and still does have lots of people who are very good at stepping outside themselves and their own life experience and their own biases in order to be able to see the other side of it.
Which ought to be what this gig is about.
Yeah, totally. And that's all part of empathy as well, which I think across the board people would say is important. But when you say, but empathy involves having an understanding of why people voted for Brexit or why people take a traditional view on women's changing rooms, then I think it becomes more problematic to some of the people in the organisation.
Andy's been in touch while we're talking. He says these urbanites you're talking about, are they fans of Mark Urban? Of course they are, Andy. Who isn't? Let's move on and talk about some
our normal fare.
Perhaps more important matters, who knows, such as Gaza. You've written in your Sunday Times column about the concessions being made on all sides to create a stabilisation force in Gaza. What would this force be? What would it do? What would it look like?
I think we look at it sometimes and we think, oh my Lord, how are we going to reconcile, the different forces there? Hamas, in a fundamental sense, doesn't want to give up power. Does Netanyahu really want to end the war, or is he looking for a pretext to restart it? Then you look at the different Arab countries or Islamic countries that have said they'll contribute to this force that's supposed to go in to sort of hold the ring and bring peace to Gaza, the stabilisation force. And, they're apparently trying to do one another down. The Egyptians and the Qataris are trying to stop the Turks from being in there and all the rest of it. And you think, how on earth can this ever get anywhere? So one of the things I did in the piece yesterday in the Sunday Times was to look at, actually you can see some fudge going on. So you talk to Israelis privately and they'll say, OK, so maybe these Hamas people, some of them will keep firearms for their own defence. And then Hamas says, we're prepared to get rid of our long-range weapons, so rocket launchers, mortars, all that sort of stuff. So on an issue like that, disarming Hamas, you can see a possible way through. I think then if the stabilisation force begins to get momentum and they'll be discussing a resolution to give it legal form in the Security Council on Thursday this week, if it can get a bit of momentum, do the countries that are contributing really have a sort of coherent view? Who's going to command it? How's it going to do the difficult stuff?
Well, and how will it engage with a still, even if it's only small arms, heavily armed Hamas on the ground?
Yeah, absolutely.
That is no longer in charge because they are.
Carry on destroying their tunnels and all the rest of it, which under the Trump plan it's supposed to do. Because there's no doubt about it that some of those countries that have offered to contribute, they see the purpose of this as keeping the Israelis out of Gaza, whereas, of course, Netanyahu thinks, if things get serious again, we can go back in, or we can do raids or targeted strikes. Whereas I think quite a few of these troop contributor nations, potentially to the stabilisation force, being Islamic nations, think, no, we're going there to stop the slaughter, keep the Israelis out, and make sure that the Israelis don't, if you like, nibble off more of Gaza, and that Gaza remains a viable part of a future Palestinian state. So those fundamental things are quite problematic, and that's why I think some people still, in Israel, a lot of people still think there's no way Netanyahu will accept it developing in that direction.
I mean, well, speaking of compromise, it's not just Israel and Hamas who are sort of quietly perhaps learning to compromise. It's also Donald Trump, because he also comes across in your piece that he's sort of he's working with the United Nations in a way one would have thought would never be possible.
Having sort of excoriated it as much as he has, because the Arab countries and the other Islamic countries who are potentially sending troops have asked him. They've said, look, if we're going to put troops in there, it's difficult, it's dangerous, and we want it to have a proper legal characteristic. And there's a kind of acceptance in the American State Department, even in the White House, that only the United Nations can do that. So yes, that's why they're going to the Security Council on Thursday. And also, Trump, We hear today that Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, is back in Israel for this thing they call Bibi sitting, which is basically trying to hold Netanyahu's feet to the fire and make sure that this process doesn't stall and lose momentum.
Finally, Mark, you've made a video for Times Original YouTube channel about how Britain's preparing for a war that could reach our shores.
Or not, yes.
Or not.
Yeah.
Hopefully will not reach our shores. I did say could. This is based on the new national security strategy. What are we up to? What are we doing?
Well, yeah, so the premise of the video, as you say, the national security strategy says for the first time in many years, we may have to accept that there could be attacks on the homeland. And the armed forces are woefully unprepared for that. They really are unprepared for state-on-state warfare, for example, and the kind of force that they could deploy and sustain if the Russians went into Estonia or Poland or something like that, a huge crisis like that, is very small. A few thousand, perhaps. But my wider point is we're not really prepared even for threats far below that. Nobody in the Ministry of Defence thinks Russia is about to invade East Anglia. That's not the question here. The question is, if an organisation like the Houthis, who, for example, in the recent past have attacked British warships and tried to kill our sailors, if they were possessed of drones with a range to hit Britain from Yemen, would they have used them? And would we actually have any effective way of bringing them down? And the short answer to that second question is no. That if they were fired in the sort of quantities that we see Russia firing drones against Ukraine, a great many would get through. Cyber attacks also happening all the time in Britain. But if the intensity of those was to increase, for example, to take down the banking system or the NHS, could we really deal with that? Those are the sort of threats that in the near term we have to really improve our readiness for.
Are we unusually poorly prepared, or is all of Europe in this boat, so to speak?
Well, I think all of Europe, in a sense, took what they call the procurement holiday after the end of the Cold War. And why not? Why not spend the money on education or fast rail or whatever, rather than, paying 100 million for a fighter jet? Perfectly understandable. But times have changed. And interestingly, in terms of public attitudes, the public seem to get that it's a lot more dangerous out there. They haven't yet got the bit about either spending more on it or indeed that some of their personal liberty, they might have to give up some of their time in terms of either reserve training or something like that. Now, views across Europe are very different on this. Now, people sometimes point to Finland and say, oh gosh, they're amazingly ready for war, and they are, but they're next door to Putin, which is an absolutely fair point. They've got a border of more than 1,000 kilometres with Russia. So I think, of course, we don't expect the same readiness that Finland has. But if you look at countries that are quite a bit further away from Putin, like Germany or Denmark, they really are upping the spending and the wider preparations in their society much more quickly than Britain is.
Is there a future, quite a soon future, where actually our military defence, I'm sorry, we've got to be brief on this, but our military defence is not dominated by warships, fighter planes, even soldiers? It's dominated in much more sort of technological way, and I don't just mean like we have a sort of drone capability alongside everything else. I mean that's what our armed forces are.
It's always going to be a blend. But you're right. I mean, the centre of gravity is shifting. I mean, let's think about those things I was just talking about as the near-term threats. Someone sending a huge drone swarm or massive cyber attack on the UK. Well, the answers to those things are not necessarily missiles and fighter jets. They could be with the drones. You can jam drones. You can cyber attack the people who launch them. You can cyber defend your critical national infrastructure better. So, yes, there is a shift towards more and more high tech and fewer of what the MOD people awfully call platforms, i.e. a ship or a plane or a tank. That's for sure. But unfortunately, you can't altogether get rid of the stuff. And the people defending the front line in the Donbass are ultimately Ukrainian infantrymen.